Did you know that the magical dark liquid that helps you survive through those miserable Monday mornings was actually discovered thanks to a herd of goats that were getting absolutely wasted and dancing like they were in a rave club? Welcome back to the BrainBoost English podcast, the only place where history is never a snooze fest, especially not in this highly caffeinated episode. Before we dive into the madness, I need you to do me a favor. Close your eyes. Imagine you are standing right in the middle of the arid Ethiopian highlands in the 9th century. The scorching sun is beating down on your shoulders. A dry breeze rustles through the thorny bushes. You take a deep breath, expecting the crisp scent of untouched nature, but instead, you catch a strong whiff of dry dirt mixed with the unmistakable aroma of fresh goat poop. And right in front of you stands a bewildered goat herder with his jaw dropping straight to the ground, staring in utter disbelief as his entire flock is partying like there is no tomorrow. They are headbanging, jumping around, and running in circles with completely bloodshot eyes. Welcome to the birthplace of coffee. Let us meet our protagonist, Kaldi. Kaldi was just a regular guy, a simple goat herder trying to make a decent living in a pre-industrial world where the most exciting thing that could happen on a Tuesday was watching the grass grow. One fateful day, Kaldi noticed something incredibly bizarre. His goats, who were usually docile, boring, and lazy, were suddenly bouncing off the walls. Or, rather, bouncing off the rocks. They were doing backflips, moonwalking, and exhibiting an amount of energy that completely defied the laws of physics. Kaldi rubbed his eyes, thinking he might have spent way too much time under the boiling sun. But no, the goats were genuinely tweaking. Being the brilliant investigative journalist that he was, Kaldi decided to follow his hyperactive animals to find out what exactly they were consuming. He tracked them down to a cluster of strange bushes with dark green leaves, covered in bright cherry red berries. The goats were munching on these berries like it was an all-you-can-eat buffet at a five-star hotel. Naturally, Kaldi applied the flawless logic of ancient mankind. If a dumb animal eats it and does not die on the spot, I should probably stuff it into my mouth too. So, he popped a handful of these red cherries into his mouth, and boom, it hit him like a massive freight train. Within minutes, Kaldi felt a massive rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He felt like he could run a marathon, wrestle a hungry lion, and invent the wheel all at the same time. He threw his hands in the air and started dancing right alongside his goats. This, my friends, was the first officially recorded caffeine trip in human history. The ultimate sugar high, but entirely without the sugar. But Kaldi was not a selfish man. He knew he had stumbled upon something revolutionary. He gathered as many of these magical berries as his pockets could hold and sprinted like an Olympic runner to the local monastery. He burst through the heavy wooden doors, interrupting a bunch of highly serious monks, and babbled at lightning speed about the magical dancing goats and the miraculous red fruit. The head monk, an incredibly strict and no-nonsense kind of guy, looked at Kaldi, looked at the weird berries, and immediately declared them to be the absolute work of the devil. "This is a demonic temptation," he yelled, probably throwing a massive tantrum, and tossed the entire handful of precious coffee cherries straight into the roaring fireplace. Now, under normal circumstances, that would be the end of the story. A sad, anticlimactic ending where everyone goes back to being sleepy. But history loves a good plot twist. As the berries began to burn in the flames, the outer flesh roasted away, exposing the inner green seeds. And as those seeds roasted, they released an aroma. Oh, what an aroma it was! It was rich, deep, intoxicating, and completely out of this world. It smelled like productivity, ambition, and avoiding your daily responsibilities. The monks stopped their boring chanting. They aggressively sniffed the air. The head monk, who just seconds ago condemned the berries to the deepest pits of hell, suddenly thought, you know what? Maybe the devil makes a really good fragrance. They desperately used metal tongs to pull the glowing, roasted beans out of the hot ashes. but the beans were way too hard to chew. Someone had the incredibly bright idea to crush them up and dissolve the black powder in hot water just to preserve this incredible smell. They cautiously took a sip of this dark, muddy water. It was bitter. It was harsh. It tasted like hot dirt. But within 20 minutes, their eyes were wide open. You see, the monks always had a huge problem: falling asleep during their extremely long, tedious midnight prayers. It is incredibly hard to stay devoted to a higher power when your eyelids weigh a ton. But with this new magical brew, they were wide awake, chanting with the intense energy of a heavy metal rock choir at 3 in the morning. They had accidentally invented the world's first energy drink. News of this miracle liquid spread through the monastery like wildfire, and soon enough, every monk in Ethiopia was chugging hot coffee just to get through their religious night shifts. But you cannot keep a secret this good contained for very long. By the 15th century, this caffeinated magic made its way across the Red Sea and safely landed on the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Yemen. Here, coffee stopped being just a religious tool for sleepy monks and quickly transformed into an absolute cultural phenomenon. The Arabs took it very seriously. They began cultivating coffee on a massive commercial scale, and more importantly, they gave it a cool name: Kawa, which originally meant wine. But since alcohol was strictly forbidden in the Islamic world, coffee became the perfect, completely legal substitute. It was the wine of Araby. This brilliant move led to the birth of something that would change human social interaction forever: the cave khane, or the coffee house. Imagine a 16th century Starbucks, but instead of girls in yoga pants taking aesthetic pictures of their iced frappuccinos, it was filled with scholars, merchants, and poets. These coffee houses were famously nicknamed schools of the wise. People did not just go there to drink coffee, they went there to actually live. They played intense games of chess, they listened to live music, they gossiped about their annoying neighbors, and most dangerously, they debated politics. For the very first time in history, ordinary citizens had a place outside their homes and boring workplaces to gather around, get extremely wired on caffeine, and talk loudly about how terrible their rulers were. These coffee houses were electric. They were the original social media platforms. Instead of scrolling mindlessly through a digital feed, you would walk into a room filled with thick, aromatic smoke, grab a tiny cup of thick, unfiltered black coffee, and listen to the latest breaking news delivered by a guy shouting in the corner. If you wanted to know who got married, who got scammed in the Grand Bazaar, or which corrupt government official was secretly taking bribes, the local coffee house was your only reliable source of information. The energy was chaotic, loud, and brilliant. And because alcohol was entirely off the table, the conversations stayed relatively coherent, making the political debates incredibly sharp and dangerous to the ruling class. As you can probably guess, the authorities absolutely hated this. The rulers of Mecca and Cairo looked at these booming coffee houses and saw breeding grounds for rebellion and revolution. I mean, nothing scares a king more than a bunch of highly awake, overly talkative citizens complaining about high taxes. In the year 1511, the powerful governor of Mecca officially banned coffee. He shut down the coffee houses by force and burned bags of coffee beans in the streets. He literally dragged terrified doctors into the courtroom to testify that this dark liquid messed with human biology and caused intoxication. But the truth was, he wasn't afraid of the drink. He was terrified of the highly energized gatherings. But trying to ban coffee from people who are already heavily addicted to it is like trying to tell a cat to stop sleeping. It is physically impossible. The citizens rioted. They secretly brewed it in their homes, turning their kitchens into underground speakeasies. They complained so loudly and passionately that the Sultan of Cairo eventually had to step in. He essentially told the governor, "Are you out of your mind? We drink that stuff too." The Sultan overturned the ban, humiliated the governor, and fired him. Coffee had won its first major political battle. It proved that caffeine addiction was way stronger than the law. From there, the coffee craze was completely unstoppable. It traveled with rich merchants, religious pilgrims, and curious travelers to Turkey, Egypt, and Persia. By the time the 16th century rolled into the 17th century, a dark, mysterious, and incredibly bitter shadow was looming over the borders of Europe. The Europeans had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. They were about to encounter a beverage that would challenge their strict religions, completely change their economies, and quite literally wake them up from the Dark Ages. But crossing into Europe was not an easy journey at all. It involved intense paranoia, massive religious panic, and a very important pope who had a surprisingly adventurous palate. When coffee finally arrived on the shores of Europe in the 17th century, specifically in the bustling trading hub of Venice, it did not receive a warm welcome. In fact, it caused an absolute religious panic. You have to understand that at this time, Europe was deeply suspicious of anything coming from the Middle East. When European merchants brought back these sacks of dark, strange-smelling beans, the local Catholic priests were horrified. They looked at this boiling, pitch-black liquid and immediately labeled it the bitter invention of Satan. They genuinely believed that since Muslims could not drink wine, which was the holy drink of Christians, the devil had given them this dark sludge as a sinister substitute. The uproar was so massive that the issue was eventually pushed all the way up to the ultimate boss of the Catholic Church, Pope Clement VIII. The priests demanded that the Pope officially ban coffee and cast it back into the fiery pits of hell where it belonged. The Pope, being a reasonable man, decided he could not condemn a beverage without at least tasting it first. A steaming cup of the supposedly demonic liquid was brought to him. The room was dead silent. The priests held their breath, expecting the Pope to spit it out, choke, or maybe get possessed by a demon. Instead, the Pope took a sip. Then he took another sip. A giant smile spread across his face. He looked at the nervous priests and declared, "This devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." And just like that, with one legendary sip, the Pope essentially gave coffee the holy stamp of approval. Suddenly, drinking coffee was not a sin anymore. It was practically a religious duty. With the Pope's blessing, coffee houses exploded across Europe. In England, they were called penny universities because for the price of 1 penny, you could buy a cup of coffee and sit for hours listening to brilliant scholars, crazy inventors, and loudmouth politicians argue about the universe. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. In 1674, the women of London actually published the famous Women's Petition against coffee. They furiously complained that their husbands were spending all their time in these dirty coffee houses, coming home smelling like roasted dirt and acting completely useless. They claimed the drink made men talkative but horribly unproductive in, well, other important marital duties. But despite the angry wives and the paranoid kings, nothing could stop the European caffeine addiction. There was just one massive problem. The Arabs still held a complete and absolute monopoly on the coffee trade. If you wanted coffee, you had to buy it from Yemen, and Yemen was not going to let their golden goose fly away. To ensure that nobody else could grow coffee, the Arab authorities enforced strict, terrifying laws. Before any coffee beans were allowed to leave the port of Mocha, they had to be heavily roasted or dropped into boiling water. This process killed the seed, making it absolutely impossible to plant. For decades, Europe was throwing massive amounts of money at the Middle East just to satisfy their caffeine cravings, and the Arabs were practically swimming in gold. But human greed, combined with a desperate need for caffeine, always finds a way. Enter the era of global coffee espionage, featuring James Bond-level smuggling operations. The person who finally broke the monopoly was not a highly trained secret agent, but a clever Indian Sufi saint named Baba Budan. In the late 17th century, Baba Budan was on a pilgrimage to Mecca. While he was there, he drank coffee and decided he simply could not live the rest of his life without it. Knowing the strict export laws, he hatched a brilliant and highly illegal plan. Before leaving Yemen, he managed to acquire 7 unroasted raw coffee seeds. He didn't hide them in his bags because the guards would search those. Instead, he strapped the 7 precious seeds to his bare chest, hiding them deep within his thick, flowing beard and underneath his heavy robes. He casually walked past the heavily armed guards, got on a boat, and successfully smuggled the seeds back to India. He planted them in the mountains of Mysore, and boom, the Arab monopoly was officially destroyed. Once the secret was out, the European empires turned into ruthless coffee pirates. The Dutch were the first to steal live coffee plants from India and smuggle them to their own colonies in Java, which is exactly why your grandfather still calls his morning coffee a cup of Java. They became unbelievably rich. Not wanting to be left behind, the French decided they needed a piece of the action. The mayor of Amsterdam generously gifted a single, beautiful coffee plant to King Louis XIV of France. The king loved it so much, he locked it inside the Royal Botanical Garden like a highly guarded prisoner. But a young, fiercely patriotic French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu believed that France needed to grow its own coffee in the Caribbean colonies. When the authorities refused to give him a piece of the king's plant, Gabriel did what any rational person would do. He broke into the royal greenhouse in the dead of night, chopped off a branch of the tree, and ran for his life. Gabriel smuggled the stolen plant onto a ship heading for the island of Martinique, and this journey was basically an action movie. First, a jealous passenger tried to steal the plant and ended up wrestling Gabriel on the deck, tearing off a branch in the process. Then, the ship was attacked by heavily armed pirates. After escaping the pirates, they sailed straight into a massive hurricane. And if that was not enough, the ship got stuck in perfectly still waters for weeks, leading to a severe water shortage. The crew was given a tiny daily ration of drinking water. Gabriel, completely obsessed with his stolen coffee plant, willingly drank only half of his tiny water ration, giving the other half to the dying plant to keep it alive. His insane dedication paid off. He made it to Martinique, planted the branch, and 50 years later, that single stolen clipping had multiplied into 18 million coffee trees across the Caribbean. Not to be outdone by the French and the Dutch, the Portuguese Empire sitting down in Brazil wanted in on the action too. In 1727, they sent a handsome, silver-tongued diplomat named Francisco de Melo Palheta to French Guiana under the excuse of settling a border dispute. But his real mission was to steal coffee seeds. The French governor was onto him and strictly forbade anyone from giving Francisco a single bean. But Francisco was a strategic genius. He completely ignored the governor and instead focused all his attention on the governor's wife. He seduced her with his charm, his looks, and his undeniable charisma. When it was time for Francisco to leave, the governor's wife organized a grand farewell dinner and publicly presented him with a magnificent bouquet of flowers. Hidden deep inside that romantic bouquet were hundreds of live coffee seeds. Francisco smiled, took the flowers back to Brazil, and single-handedly kickstarted what is now the largest coffee empire on the entire planet. So, there you have it. The next time you walk into a fancy cafe, pay $6 for an iced caramel macchiato and complain that the barista spelled your name wrong. Take a moment to look at that cup. You are holding a liquid that started as a strange snack for hyperactive goats in Ethiopia. A drink that was cursed by monks, banned by fearful kings, and literally baptized by the Pope. a beverage that inspired the first social media networks, fueled dangerous political revolutions, and caused global empires to lie, cheat, and steal from each other on a massive scale. History is not just a bunch of old guys signing treaties. Sometimes it is just a bunch of incredibly exhausted humans doing absolutely crazy things just to stay awake. Thank you for tuning in to the BrainBoost English podcast. Now, go finish your coffee. The capitalist machine needs you.